from Selma town. Right, oh, the mud sure was deep. Right.
Democracy is only representative if everybody can freely exercise the right to vote. Although our founding fathers declared that all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence, in practice, only white, landowning men could vote at the birth of our nation. Almost 100 years after emancipation, African Americans were still being denied their right to vote, despite the 15th Amendment, which was supposed to give all citizens access to the ballot box. Discriminatory laws and customs ensured that African Americans did not have equal opportunities. These injustices caught the attention of many civil rights activists, including Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1965, a large group of people gathered to take a stand against these problems in Selma, Alabama, where only 2% of the black population was registered to vote. At great personal risk, the Selma marchers took a stand by fighting for their right to vote and by protesting and overcoming police brutality. Their persistence and sacrifice led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The fight for voting rights took place mainly in the mid-60s during the heart of the civil rights movement. Although citizenship and equal protection had been granted to all citizens over 100 years ago with the 14th Amendment, the country was far from equal. Throughout the nation, African Americans peacefully protested racism and segregation by sitting at whites-only lunch counters, boycotting buses, and marching for freedom. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which criminalized discrimination in public areas and workplaces and strengthened prohibitions against school segregation and voter discrimination. Although this was a victory for the civil rights movement, the voting issue was not resolved by this law. Officially, African Americans had the right to vote, but states used a variety of tactics to preclude registration. Southern states in particular required literacy tests that asked obscure questions about past presidents and the Constitution. If they passed this test, there were still obstacles to overcome that were determined by each state, such as poll taxes. Despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act, these practices continued, effectively limiting the number of African Americans who could actually vote. George Wallace, the governor of Alabama at the time, was a notorious segregationist.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Selma, Alabama was a microcosm for the corruption and racism that kept African Americans from voting throughout the South. On January 2, 1965, the SCLC and Martin Luther King began their Selma campaigns. In the beginning, the Selma movement consisted of small protests and night marches. However, they encountered a lot of resistance from the local government. First, a Dallas County judge banned groups from meeting to discuss civil rights or voter registration in Selma, and then Governor George Wallace banned night marches. Wallace assigned state troopers to break up these marches, resulting in violent confrontations. This led to the murder of a young protester named Jimmy Lee Jackson. Jackson was trying to protect his mother from being beaten when he was shot by an Alabama state trooper while protesting. King, the SCLC, and the Selma community organized the three major voting rights marches, partly in tribute to Jimmy Lee Jackson. The protesters not only marched for the right to vote, they also marched in the memory of someone who was wrongfully killed fighting for their cause. By marching to Montgomery, the marchers hoped to show Governor Wallace that they would no longer stand for the voter suppression happening in Alabama. However, it was not easy for them to complete their march. The marchers' first attempt, led by John Lewis and Hosea Williams, failed when Alabama state troopers viciously forced them to disperse. This attack is now known as Bloody Sunday.
They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, trampling us with horses, and releasing the tear gas. Was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. My legs went from under me. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die. I thought it was the last non-violent protest for me. I don't recall how I made it back across that bridge.
The marchers were treated for fractured skulls, legs, and ribs at a makeshift hospital in a nearby church. In the face of physical danger, the marchers refused to give up. 2 days later, King led the second march. But this time, when they reached the barricade of troops, they knelt and prayed and then turned around without a confrontation. The demonstrators were finally able to complete their march after an Alabama judge ruled that the First Amendment to the Constitution gave them the right to peacefully protest. The persistence of the marchers conveyed the importance of the issue, and their courage in the face of violence showed that they were willing to risk their lives to demand the right to vote. The hardships the marchers faced did not stop when they obtained legal approval. The 25,000 protesters walked over 10 miles a day on their 52-mile journey to Montgomery. Marchers, young and old, slept in fields and in mud, sacrificing their comfort to take a stand. They walked through heat and rain, determined to reach Montgomery. Along the way, they also encountered cars covered in racial slurs and jeering white onlookers.
You're seeing close-ups of crowd figures standing by the marchers as we're marching along. And it's clearly by expression on their faces, the kind of anger and hostility to us.
Upon finally arriving in Montgomery, King described the challenges they overcame and the length they would go to fight for their rights.
Let us march on ballot. Let us march until the water seas of our nation tremble away in silence. Let us march on ballot until we send to our city council, state legislatures, and the United States Congress men who will not fear to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God.
In this statement, King reached the core of why barring African Americans from the polls created such a political imbalance in the United States. African Americans were not represented and could not keep racist politicians out of office. Since politicians did not have to worry about getting African American votes for re-election, they did not have to take their needs into account. The demonstrators were determined to fight until they had equal access to the ballot box. The most significant outcome of the Selma marches was the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. President Johnson referenced Selma in his speech urging Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act.
At times, history and fate meet at a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama.
The Voting Rights Act eliminated tactics like literacy tests, prohibited states from creating laws that would prevent people from voting, and replaced local clerks with impartial federal examiners. This act was signed into law on August 6, 1965. The act increased the percentage of registered African American voters in Alabama from 19% to 65% in just 5 years. However, in the Supreme Court case Shelby County v. Holder, 2013, Section 5 of the law, which requires states with a history of voter discrimination to submit potential changes in their voting laws to the government for approval, was ruled unconstitutional. The Supreme Court opinion argues that disparities in voter registration and turnout have been eliminated, and therefore parts of the Voting Rights Act do not reflect current conditions. This decision reveals the current relevance of the message driven by the Selma marches. In March 2015, protesters, led by President Obama, returned to Selma, with the hope to convince Congress that the Voting Rights Act is still needed, in its entirety. Already, in 2016, we saw the impact of this decision as we watched the first election not fully protected by the Act unfold. New voter registration laws enacted without pre-clearance were found to be deliberately discriminatory by the courts. In an effort to prevent voter fraud, 3 counties in North Carolina unlawfully removed voters from their registration lists. These voters turned out to be disproportionately African American. The NAACP sued North Carolina because of this policy, which allows citizens to petition the legality of a fellow citizen's voter registration. By risking their safety to take a stand against police brutality and voter discrimination, the Selma marchers helped pass the Voting Rights Act, a law that until recently protected equal access to voting. No one can discount the progress made since Selma. However, with every unfair law passed and every protective law repealed, our country slowly regresses back to the state it was in at the time of the Selma marches. It is important that the achievements and sacrifices of the Selma marchers are recognized, but it is equally important that Americans realize there is still work to be done until voting in the United States is completely free from racism.